Motivate Public Servants in the 21st Century panel, organized by the Astana Civil Service Hub, jointly with the United Nations Development Program and the Graduate School of Public Policy of the Nazarbayev University. My name is Tokjan Ahmedjanova, and I'm the specialist on partnerships for the Astana Civil Service Hub. Today, I have the honor to assume a role of moderator for the first part of our session, which includes the opening ceremony and discussion on global trends and contemporary research. Let me now invite our four distinguished and honorable speakers onto the stage and ask them to take their seats. Ms. Mirjana Spolaric-Egger, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Assistant Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Director of the UNDP Bureau for Europe and the CIS. Mr. Shigeo Katsu, President of the Nazarbayev University. We have small changes in our agenda, and unfortunately, Chairman of the Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan for Civil Service and Anti-Corruption, Mr. Shbekbaev, is not able to join us today, and we have Ms. Aygul Shaimova, Deputy Chairperson of the Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan for Civil Service Affairs and Anti-Corruption, and Mr. Alihan Baymenov, Chairman of the Steering Committee of the Astana Civil Service Hub. Please give a warm welcome to our esteemed colleagues for coming and joining us today. Dear honorable speakers, please feel free to use the speaker stand or deliver your speech from the place. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Baymenov. Mr. Chairman, please.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear friends. Welcome to Astana Economic Forum, and we're very happy to welcome you within the framework of the sixth session. The role of the state service to solve the common problems of the modern time is of a great importance, and in its turn, it is identified not only with the volume of knowledge and skills, but also by the motivation of the state servants. The striving for to serve your people is the key role in terms of the development and adherence of any country, society, and the nation overall. Having understand that the chairman of the government of Alashorda, Alikhan Bukhanov, 100 years ago, used to be saying that the service to your nation is the key.
VUCA world, disruptive technologies, and rising expectations of citizens place new demands on the quality of public administration, a fact that is recognized in the SDGs. Increasingly, extensive development of information technologies, social networking, and social media enable citizens to compare and assess the performance of their governments against certain benchmarks. This is resulting in a quasi-competitive environment in which government agencies have to constantly improve their performance. In this context, civil servants should possess the required competences to effectively respond to these increased expectations. However, the overall quality of civil service also depends on such other factors as the level of motivation of public servants, as well as their moral and commitment to their jobs. A lot of attention is paid to these factors nowadays, or to what is often referred as the new public passion. Thus, this is the reason we all gathered here today to talk about reward and recognition in the public service. It seems that these factors have been a subject of discussion for many centuries to date. For instance, our ancestor and great thinker Al-Farabi highlighted 11 centuries ago 12 character traits that a public servant should possess. Among those, he mentioned honesty and commitment to public service as core values necessary for high performance. About the same time, Yusuf Balasaguni, our famous philosopher from Central Asia, outlined professional skills civil servants should possess for 15 public positions. Among those, he paid special tribute to dignity and motivation. More recently, public service motivation, or PSM, has become one of the key areas of public administration theory. In this connection, we are honored to have James Perry as a keynote speaker today, the person who coined the term public service motivation. Using this opportunity, let me express my sincere gratitude to Professor Perry for accepting our invitation. I believe that Professor Perry's valuable theoretical insights combined with practical experience of hubs participating countries will greatly contribute to designing effective motivation and reward systems. At this point, it's worth noting that this is a uniqueness of the hub that is bringing academics and practitioners together in devising and proposing policies and practices that are pertinent to public service development. Recognizing the importance of motivation for attaining public service excellence, the subject seems to be on the agenda of many governments in the region and beyond. To this end, the Astana Civil Service Hub is also focusing on motivation and other factors that are conducive to enhancing the performance of public servants. For example, first, the hub, together with Singapore Public Service Excellence Center, completed in 2018 a study on the motivation of civil servants in Kazakhstan and Pakistan. Second, it has supported the government of Kazakhstan in the development of a new pay system through the implementation of one of its largest development projects in past 5 years. And third, the hub has just completed a draft version of a comparative review of public sector compensation systems, as a compensation is also considered a factor in motivating public servants. Preliminary results of this study will be presented today. Dear colleagues, the Astana Civil Service Hub, a joint initiative of the government of Kazakhstan and UNDP, has a mission to assist the governments of its 41 participating countries in civil service development. Since its inception, the hub is fortunate to enjoy the continuous support of the UNDP Country Office and the Regional Bureau for Europe and Central Asia. For this, allow me to express my appreciation to Ms. Mirjana Spoljaric-Egger and to welcome her in her first visit to Kazakhstan. In implementing its mission, the Astana Hub works through 3 main pillars: partnerships and networking, peer-to-peer learning and capacity building, and joint research and knowledge sharing. The Hub's agenda is flexible and demand-driven, given that public sector change is constant nowadays. In this connection, the Hub regularly conducts needs assessment surveys and consults with its advisory board to identify priority topics for bringing more value to its participating countries. One such priority is designing effective motivation and reward systems that includes decent assessment policies and remuneration frameworks. Another priority is to assist public policy schools in the region in enhancing their capacities. A key partner in this is the Graduate School of Public Policy of Nazarbayev University. And using this opportunity, I would like to say special thanks to the President of Nazarbayev University, Mr. Shigeo Katsu, for his collaboration and support. The Astana Civil Service Hub also works closely with a key government partner, the Agency for Civil Service Affairs and Anti-Corruption, that's responsible for civil service development in Kazakhstan. In this regard, we are pleased to welcome and express our appreciation to Mr. Alik Shpekbayev, Chairman of the agency, Deputy Chairman Aygul Shaimova, for their continuous support and cooperation. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that There is a direct relationship between the effectiveness of an organization and the motivation of its workforce. I hope that today's session will allow us to better understand and enhance our awareness on how to motivate civil servants through various schemes of recognition and rewards and design novel solutions for our countries. Allow me to wish for a productive session and fruitful work. Thank you very much. Rahmet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Mirjana Spolaric-Egger.
Mr. Boimanov and dear Chairman, dear President Katsu, and dear colleagues, I'm very honored to join you this afternoon in this very important discussion that is based on our partnership with the Civil Service Hub and the university, the Nazarbayev University in Nur-Sultan. I'm also delighted to have the opportunity to hear experts as much as I can, and I will read my statement quickly so that I can hear my following speakers before I have to move on to the next meeting, because this is a really important topic and one that is very dear to me personally, but one that is very close to the core of what UNDP does in this region. Millions of people in the region depend on the capacity of public services to anticipate their needs and to deliver quality services. And we've heard Madame Lagarde yesterday, if these services are not of quality, then the institutions are perceived as weak, and then trust in government entities fails to happen. So we are here to discuss the fundamental question of how we can motivate civil service staff and empower government officials to achieve positive results to the service of their population. And in answering this question, we shouldn't be talking about one-size-fits-all models, but to look at the cultural, institutional, and organizational factors that are relevant in a specific context. But generally, based on our own experience, UNDP internally, we can say that high-performing teams, institutions, and pattern in organizations, that in large organizations and institutions, certain patterns are discernible. Performance is highest in diverse and inclusive organizations where equality is respected and actively pursued, and when the twin threats of discrimination and corruption are quashed. So indicators of high performance appear when an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect is created, when meritocracy is respected, and when calculated risk-taking is encouraged, and when adequate space is created for innovation, and when failure and mistakes are not punished, but used as learning opportunities for new ventures. Another important and less tangible factor that lies at the heart of public service is purpose. We need to know who we serve, and we need to know why we serve. So public service can be rewarded by financial incentives. However, UNDP research has shown that non-monetary incentive systems appear to contribute more sustainably and more effectively to enhancing public sector and civil service performance. So we hope that there will be room during this event to discuss your experience and to learn from your lessons on this subject. And even though I myself will not be sitting in the room, my colleagues will, and we will be very happy to take it forward. Dear colleagues, leadership is critical to ensure high levels of civil service performance, because however motivated the people are who work in an organization, they also need the resources and the tools and the trust in them to implement their tasks. So we partner with governments around the world to strengthen their institutions, and we do so, as I said before, based on our own internal experience, because UNDP works in 170 countries with 17,000 employees. So we combine what we do in the country with the government to what we do internally with our own staff. So also in Kazakhstan, we work in very critical areas of public service delivery and public reforms to ensure that the state apparatus is professional, free of corruption, and according to OECD standards. And we are currently undergoing ourselves the deepest reform that UNDP has ever gone through. And this is, again, the reason why we are so particularly interested in hearing your experiences and advice. But for us, it is clear that we have to focus on a people strategy that is comprehensive, that is understandable for everybody, that makes sense for all staff, and that creates transparent and acceptable development opportunities for all staff going forward. So we are just at the beginning of implementing this new people strategy, and we will let you know how it goes, but this will certainly have an impact on how we advise governments going forward. So with this, I wish you a very successful event, constructive discussions, and again, many thanks for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mirjana Spolaric-Egger. Now, please let me kindly give the floor to Mr. Katsu.
Good afternoon. I am painfully aware that I have to entertain you just after probably a very nice lunch. And it always comes with the risk that people's mind may be occupied otherwise, and that the motivational factor and even the reward factor of sitting here and listen might be a little bit low. So let me share with you some of my own internal musings that I've picked up after listening attentively to all the presentations yesterday in the very interesting opening sessions, and obviously the implications for the topic that we are going to discuss. And what I found very interesting yesterday, and actually even the person who said it was himself quite surprised, Paul Romer, he of the University of Chicago, admitted that actually a minimalist government would not cut it. He acknowledged that in today's world, not just only today's, but all through times, there are certain functions that only public monopoly can actually exercise in terms of building rule of law, building the trust of people, and importantly, exercise those privileges. And for that, you cannot have too little a government or public sector, and you cannot have too big a public sector, no? And it sort of starts to point us already in the direction of what it takes to build such a good performing public sector. Then we heard yesterday also, obviously, two presentations, one by the President Armen Sargsyan of Armenia, and the Prime Minister of Georgia. And what I found very interesting is that both mentioned that actually in the course of their career, they used to be civil servants at a certain point. Now, I think it's a great motivational factor, maybe also high reward for any civil servant if they know that there are some role models who have even risen to the positions of presidents and prime ministers of their country. However, we all know that those chances are, for most civil servants, rather small. So it's nice aspirational, but to pull us all back to the ground, I think we need to think about some other motivational devices. But interestingly enough, then we had two presentations from the business side. if you recall. German Gref, as well as the chairman of Nokia, Simala. And what they basically pointed out was, number one, in today's world, change is constant. Change is constant, and therefore, any entity, they were talking more from the business side, certainly, they will have to constantly think about transforming themselves and reinventing themselves. Now, in a way, this ought to apply to public service as well, because public service cannot be isolated from the rest, neither of society nor of the economy. But it's intrinsically much more difficult for public service to constantly reinvent itself and transform itself, simply because the metrics on how do you measure performance are quite different from the bottom line that we see in the private sector. Miriana already referred to Madame Lagarde's point on a performing public sector. But importantly also, we heard President Nazarbayev talk about the primordial importance of establishing trust so that the citizen and the leadership can understand each other. And that comes through consistent conduct, showing role modeling, showing the values, living the values, and being able to guide the aspirations and then fulfilling the aspirations of citizenship. Now, all of these point to indeed the challenge of, in today's more complex VUCA world that Chairman Baimenov mentioned, on how do we motivate but also reward civil servants. And the challenges, in my view, are further increased also because, let's face it, with all due respect to my esteemed Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy, Venkat, and his team, and some of his colleagues are here, and indeed, when Mr. Baimenov said, thank you very much, Nazarbayev University, it was not towards me, it's actually towards Venkat, because he and his team are really doing the work with the academy. But the thing is that we are today trying to nurture, develop, educate future leaders and future leaders in this public service, public sector, civil service, that are probably the first digital generation. For them, doing everything through the smartphone is second nature. Probably you all, I think the audience here, can identify with it. Yet, you know, when you have professors of my age group and others, you sort of wonder, can we actually really relate to each other properly? And what does it take to really motivate a totally new generation that has totally different life experiences than our generation? And that adds to a lot of the challenges. So I would be quite curious if in some of the discussions today, this generational aspect and the disruptive nature or transformational nature of technology will also come up. The other part is that, challenge is that, as we heard, let's say 2040, 2050, Kazakhstan aspires to be part of the top 30 nations. Everybody understands that making money is not enough. What really counts is the welfare and well-being of the population. We also heard that by 2050, basically 4/5 of GDP will be produced in urban agglomerations, and most of both productivity, creativity, but also some of the drawbacks of big agglomerations will all be concentrated in cities. And that means that urban management and urban management leadership is going to take an increasingly proportionately and more important role, even compared with central government activities. It means it has huge implications as to the quality, the ability, the enabling environment that are also needed to attract top talent into local government as much as it is a challenge to attract them to central government. And, you know, we know that big cities have drawing powers, but unless they're properly managed, the negative externalities will start to outweigh the positive ones. So there are all these challenges that and I'm sure you will probably add more and others to this, that I see when I look forward in terms of how to motivate civil servants in this age. And to me, in a way, to find a partial response at least to it, start to think in terms of, are we still correct in drawing a distinction between serving in the public sector versus serving in the private sector? Some of the motivations probably ought to be relatively similar. The risk-reward elements ought to probably converge. And if there's maybe slight difference, it may be because of the moral commitment. On one side, you can rationalize with the bottom line, and presumably serving in the public sector, you have sort of higher moral aspirations maybe and trying to do good intrinsically. But yet, unless we find a convergence on how we manage both sides, we will not probably do justice to neither the motivational part nor the reward elements for future generations of the civil service. Just to take a leaf out of, referring a little bit to my own institution, that is why we often talk about having our public policy school, being very closely also engaged with our business school side, and both of them serving almost as a hub for all the other graduate schools and their respective more deeper, vertical discipline, in a way, pursuit, knowledge pursuit. In a way, a future civil servant has to understand how business works, what motivates them, in order to be able to provide good services. The private sector better understand how public sector works and what motivates them in order to get their pet ideas through. But overall, it is in the end the citizen who has to judge and has to be satisfied that indeed the public sector and, importantly, also the private sector are there to help them and serve everybody in the interest of national as well as regional global development. And some of the key, obviously, key concerns of and challenges of today, we've also amply heard them throughout the forum: climate change issues, inequality issues, and others which are transcendent of national, regional boundaries. And any risk, reward, motivation of civil servants, I do hope, are going to find psychic income elements also by addressing some of the most seemingly complex and difficult challenges of our lifetime for future generations' sake. So I rather pontificated maybe more in terms of the challenges that I see. I have only hinted at what I think are some of the possible ways forward. But as we know, evidence-based policy is what counts. So hopefully, the discussions will also touch upon those key elements, that what are needed in terms of establishing a good conceptual framework that will stand the test of time. So thank you very much, and I look forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katsu. Due to the very important and high-level meeting with the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan, Ms. Mirjana Spolaric-Egger have to leave us, so let us thank her very much for participation and valuable speech. I have a great pleasure to invite and to give the next floor to Ms. Shaimova.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I would like to break the settings for this session, and I'm going to speak English. First of all, I would like to thank the UNDP, the regional hub of the United Nations, for organizing this section. We're very pleased as an authority to have a chance to discuss within the framework of those 2 days, using Astana Economic Forum platform, those important issues, because it's a great experience for us, and we find solutions for many, many questions and issues that we have. In the first part of the day, we've been looking at the transformational leadership, and now we're looking at how to motivate and reward the state servants. As the previous 2 speakers have identified, those issues are closely related. Without motivating the leaders and without having the idea of what the transformation leaders are, it's impossible to move forward. So just lately, Ms. Egger was looking at efficiency and a need of having a trust and so did Mr. Shigeo Katsu. They both said that there has to be a right for a mistake. And again, going back through a prism of motivation and efficiency, I'd like to have your attention to certain components. So first of all, I think we need to mention that the globalization makes the world changing, and we have to keep up with all of the trends that we face in our daily life. And certainly it's so important to not to only pick the right personnel, but to retain those people. And for state service of the Republic of Kazakhstan, it is very, very crucial. And the practice is that once the person gets experience, they leave for a private sector. Why? Because the social protection package for state servants in some cases cannot compete with the one provided by the private sector. So one of the issues the top managers have to be dealing with is to develop a flexible system on motivation. It shouldn't be a one-time solution. It has to be a product of evolution for a certain period of time. There's a stereotype and the practice when we make our choice in terms of what profession to pick. One of the components is whether it is prestigious or not. The next factor is, and we never think about it, are we going to be able of doing a job? And many surveys looked at the salary, and in accordance with the social surveys, in accordance with the respondents' opinion, only 12% of respondents make choice depending on the salary size. And again, the reward and an ability to be rewarded is one of the most crucial motivation factors for respondents. It is important for a person to feel that his or her opinion is taken into account, and that he or she may somehow influence upon what's going on. And starting from 2016, we have had some practical instruments and tools that we have been using so far. So we now have a career-based model for the state servants. So we have a very prominent promotion waves at the moment. So secondly, we've been actually working on changing the organizational culture for state service, and the priority is to have the relationships based on a trust. And besides, we keep working on getting rid of excessive documentation. Just take a look. We have 1,200 different reports, and those reports have been generated on an annual basis, and the agency is now getting rid of those reports. And we have been successfully optimizing our business processes, including a need to centralize the legal service, the HR and accounting services altogether. And I'd like to be talking about automation of HR service. Starting from last year, we've been pretty active. And as a result, the efficiency is now stronger in 14 folds. We are not wasting our time for paper processing. We have all of the documentation in an automatic regime. And the automation provides us a chance to create any order within 6 minutes. We used to be having 26 people dealing with the HR issues before, and now it's only 3 people. The next issue, it is important to ensure that the person is rewarded. We need to acknowledge the personal achievement. And in this regard, it's been the 3rd year when we have our competition for the best state servant. And in 3 years' time, I can assure you that this competition is getting more and more popular because the number of participants has been drastically increased. And this year, on the 23rd of June, we're going to be having this competition for the best state servant. So, dear colleagues, you still have time to compete, so please, you're welcome to. So, in addition, we do have the best prize for the best state servant of Kazakhstan, and you also have time to compete for that one. Of course, every state servant has to be feeling that he or she is of need. So our aim is to ensure the maximum engagement into the business processes, and the unique solution would be the following. At the Academy of State Service, we have set up the opinion exchange and brainstorm factory. So what makes this platform unique is that this platform has put the top managers together for an open discussion of all of the issues, and the discussion is provided on an equal basis. The executives and the leaders, the top managers, can share their opinions absolutely equally. And the authors of the best ideas are inspired to be generating more and more ideas. And the initiative number 5 that I would like to say about is our practices. And it's not just copy-pasting. We implement those ideas, taking into account our national realia, and Kazakh State Service used to be having a lot of overtime practices, and right now the number of overtime has has been decreased by 91%, and there's a balance of the private life, and there's room for professional development. We even have received the thank you letters from the family members of our state servants. So as a pilot project, we're going to be starting a pilot. They start working at 8:30 and they be free at 5:30. 5:30 in the evening, and we open space practice has also been introduced. It makes it closer. The casual Friday practice has also been suggested. That's a unique experience that creates a certain atmosphere. Again, going back to material motivation, and the material stimulation also exists. We do have the basic a social package, including the pension coverage, medical insurance, and at least for us, it's very, very important. You can get the slots at the kindergartens, and plus our state servants have a right for housing programs as well. And what's new, our agency has introduced a new remuneration system, and the major difference we used to be saying is that we work the same, but we get paid in a different manner, and we're trying to get away from a practice when everyone would be paid the same amounts of money. So we're going to pay each and every 7 depending on the effectiveness. The pilot has been lasting for 1.5 years. We ensure the better attractiveness, and the Akimat of Mangostau region, that has never ever been attractive from an employment standpoint. Right now it has a competition of 28 people per slot. We used to be having the competitions when we did not have candidates at all. So these are the briefly package of state servants. We do have different packages of stimulation for state servants. Today we'll have a chance to introduce new tools. Thank you.
Dear honorable speakers, we are grateful to all of you for opening remarks. We invite you to take your seats in the middle of the hall. Please let me proceed to our first session. Today we will have interesting presentations from distinguished speakers. A special feature of the panel is a combination of academic views and practical knowledge devoted to motivation of public servants. Thereby, our session is divided in 2 parts, first of which is on global trends and contemporary research, and the second one is on the case studies of the participating countries of the ACSH. After each part, we will have a session dedicated to questions and discussions. Thereby, there will be an opportunity to ask your questions and share your opinions, views, and comments. Now, I would like to invite our next speakers onto the stage and ask them to take their seats. Mr. James Lee Perry, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of the Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs of the Indiana University, Bloomington, United States of America. Ms. Gulmira Raisova, Chairperson of the Coordination Council of the Association of Human Resources Managers of Kazakhstan. Mr. Bhaskaran Nair, Adjunct Associate Professor, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore, Visiting Professor of the Graduate School of Public Policy of the Nazarbayev University, and Mr. Panas Liverakas, Technical Advisor for ACSH and the United Nations Development Program in Kazakhstan. Please, will you join me, yes, in a round of applause for the speakers. And now, I have the honor to give the floor to our keynote speaker, distinguished professor, Mr. James Perry.
I can stand in front of this guy over here because he's not going to be shielded from the audience. Let me ask, how many of you got the memo today about the Casual Friday? Okay, so no, we haven't gotten there yet because I was looking around and I didn't see a lot of people prepared for Casual Friday today, but I'm glad you're here anyway. My presentation today is on civil service system design and performance, aligning institutions, individuals, and incentives, and I'm going to try to get through that in about 20 minutes. I started this research in 1990, so we're encapsulating 30 years worth of work into 20 minutes, but I will try not to run over, since I know you would like to have, issue some questions. Let me sort of also comment. I looked at the title. I've been working on this for like 2 months. Now, it may not show it, but I've been working on it for 2 months. And Diana Sharapova from the from the Civil Service Hub kept sending me messages like, send us your speech, send us your PowerPoints. And so I've sort of put this stuff together maybe earlier than I would have expected. And I've gone back to it and I've redone a few things. But as I was sort of preparing for the presentation, one question came to me, and that is, what is my key message? What's my sort of bottom line message? And I was watching a piece the other day on CNN about the 50 top disruptors. And I think some of our opening plenary speakers also referred yesterday to disruption. And I'm doing a book for the Volcker Alliance in the US where disruption is a sort of a key component. We get into blockchain and AI and all that stuff that I know absolutely nothing about. But it occurred to me that what I'm talking about is really sort of a generational, more than a generational transformation of civil service systems. That is part of the idea, and Chairman Baimanoff referred to the new public passion that both the Civil Service Hub as well as the Global Center for Public Service Excellence in Singapore, when it was in business with UNDP, discovered. And that sort of surprised me, because we had essentially 40 developing countries gravitate to the research that I sort of took for granted and thought more about in terms of developed countries than developing countries. So part of what I'm sort of talking about, and it may not be obvious from what I say, is disruption. That is, and what I've come to this partly because, as the intro indicated, I'm Distinguished Professor Emeritus. For those of you that need a translation on that, that means retired. But you know, I've been working in this area. I got my PhD in '74, and I've been working on issues related to motivation since the mid-1970s. So after 45 years, I'm sort of trying to think, what is it that I sort of can bring to this as my final message, my swan song? And I am working on a book. I wish I had the book done. That's trying to translate the research into practice. That is, how would we redesign our civil service systems if we took seriously all the research that's been done over the last 30+ years on the concepts that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Okay, so enough intro. I've already killed about 5 minutes, but it's about disruption, And believe me, next Friday I want to see you all in shorts and casual wear. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to try to do this very quickly because I only have about 15 minutes. First of all, I'm going to talk about three other-oriented motivation constructs. They're really at the core of what I call, or what Chairman Baimenoff calls, the new public passion. And I think that's sort of critically important. That if we're disrupting the system as it has existed since I entered graduate school in 1970, we're moving in a much different direction that's based on these other-oriented motivation constructs. The second thing I want to talk about, and this is something I believe in strongly, and I want to share it with you, maybe to bring you along with me, and that is that I think the research on public service motivation, and I'm going to define that more broadly in a moment, is the foundation for reform. We have lots of evidence. The President Katsu referred to the evidence-based, I think you referred to, somebody did, to evidence-based, and that's certainly an important component of my argument here. The third thing I want to talk about is aligning institutions, individuals, and incentives. Now, during my research career, I've come face to face with some misalignment. Misalignment that has carried the day. Some misalignment that still carries the day. And until we move away from that misalignment, we're not going to get it right. So we need to think about aligning our institutions, incentives, and individuals. And that's sort of an important combination of knitting those facets of our civil service systems and our public motivation systems together. And then finally, and a lot of this is already on record in published articles, I want to talk about design principles that enhance alignment. And I've got 8. I may not be able to cover all of them in much detail, but certainly I know I did a document, a paper, that's people, if they want to get a hold of the paper, I'm sure can get a hold of the paper. Am I correct in that? Yeah, okay. So that's what I want to cover. Now let me go to those 3 other-oriented motivation concepts. First of all, public service motivation. And you've got the definition here from an article that I and Lois Wise, a colleague at Indiana University, published in 1990 in Public Administration Review. The definition is an individual's predisposition to respond to motives grounded primarily or uniquely in public institutions and organizations. Now, I've been doing research on motivation since at least the late 1970s. One of the things I never encountered until I read that definition was the effort to articulate what in fact is different about the public sector and what we referred to when I was a graduate student as the public ethos, and how that differs from motivation elsewhere. And we did have the question, I think Ms. Eggers or someone raised the question about the public-private difference. I believe there are differences, but maybe more important than that is that we need to sort of accept the differences that are and sort of move forward designing our systems consistent with those differences. Because if we ignore the differences and say whatever is done in the private sector is right, then we're going to continue to confront this misalignment that I think has been very prominent during my career. The second concept, and I visited this concept when I first started doing this research, was the idea of altruism. And the slide defines altruism, motivation based on considerations of another's need rather than one's own. I think that's sometimes referred to as the maternal instinct or whatever, but I'm a man, I wouldn't understand that. But when I first started doing research in this area, I was interested in trying to get a handle on what altruism was and whether that applied to what we do in the public sector. Now, we can go too far with saying that what we do is altruistic, but I think altruism is certainly relevant, and there's a lot of research that points to that. And then the third concept, one that again came along about the same time as this idea of public service motivation, which with all due respects, I have to give credit to my colleague Hal G. Rainey, who used that term in a 1982 article in the American Review of Public Administration. I've never sort of embraced the term myself, but But this notion of pro-social motivation goes back to the late 80s, early 90s. But it's the desire to have a positive impact on other people, groups, and organizations. And often when we talk about public service and why we do public service, we get into this idea that, hey, listen, I'm doing it to help a group with which I identify. I'm doing it to help my community. I'm doing it to do good for other people. So there's a sort of a pro-social component. Now, the reason I bring those three concepts together is they're related to one another. And they also have another consequence. They're related to one another in the sense that they converge around this emphasis on other orientation. Now, why is that important? Because for many years, the institutional assumptions we made about motivation in public organizations were all about self-interest and the self rather than the other. Now, my key argument, and I'm not going to go into it much later because I don't have that much time, but is that, you know, if we want to think about public institutions, we need to embrace this idea of other orientation. As long as we embrace and think that what we do is out of self-interest, and that's sort of a core principle of the way we design our civil service systems, we're going to be sadly disappointed in the results we get. And again, that's, I'm going through the details of my presentation, and I realize I sort of spill over into personal belief a lot. There's a lot of evidence about some of these things, but I also believe these things, and I sort of have difficulty separating the two, but I think it's important that we recognize that this other orientation is critical to our movement forward in designing civil service systems, motivational structures in government that work for those institutions rather than for the private sector. And again, somebody asked the question earlier about the difference between public and private motivation. I have some credentials. I spent 11 years, my first job was as assistant professor in what was called the Generic School of Administration. It's now a business school. It subsequently became a management school, but I did my public administration in a place where I was working alongside the best and the brightest who were studying the private sector. And I think we all agree, not only me, but my private colleagues, that there are differences, and we need to sort of embrace and understand those differences. Okay, so much for definitions. Now, again, let me make this argument for those of you that may be going forward and redesigning and developing systems. And I wish I had this book to share with you now to put it in more black and white, the evidence that we have. But I think there are sort of three reasons why I think the research on public service motivation, altruism, pro-social motivation can be very useful as a foundation for reform. First of all, as one of our other speakers already mentioned, it's evidence-based. If you go to my website, where I keep mainly the research on public service motivation, since that original article in 1990, there are about 500 sources. The volume of research has grown exponentially. If you look at a review article we published in Public Administration Review in 2016, the curve goes up, you know, like the space shuttle, exponentially. The other thing that's happening today, partly because of some of us calling for more experimental work, is that we have a much higher quality of research being done today than we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and a lot of it's experimental. Matter of fact, let me give you an example. On the way here, a political scientist at Northwestern University sent me 4 papers, all experiments on Ukraine and Russia, studying the relationship between public service motivation and corruption, suggesting that the nature of the institutions may have something to do with the attributes and the quality of the people. And so public service motivation may be important for staving that off. That's a result of experimental research using samples in Russia and Ukraine. And they mentioned, by the way, that those 2 countries are known for high levels of corruption. I didn't verify that myself, but that was in the abstract. So we've got a lot of evidence, and that evidence is getting better, and it's accelerating. The other thing we have is I think we have comprehensive evidence. Now, typically when I talk about motivation, one of the things I emphasize is what is it we're trying to motivate? The new public management sort of gave us this mindset that the only thing we're trying to motivate is high performance. I would use an American slang term here, but you wouldn't understand that. It was introduced to me by my twin brother. But the reality is that we need to motivate people to join the organization. You talked about joining and retaining people. We need to get them to do their jobs day in and day out reliably. And we also need them to engage in innovative and spontaneous behavior, maybe high performance. So they need to do lots of things. But I think the research, for instance, on public service motivation, altruism, and pro-social motivation says, hey, we've covered all those topics. We got research on all those areas. Whether it's organizational selection or retention or tardiness or absenteeism or high job performance or whatever, we got research on that. So this body of evidence is not only growing exponentially in number and in quality, but it's also focused on a whole range of topics to help redesign our civil service systems. And we need to be focused on that. And then finally, the other component where I think this research is important is that it's coherent. Now, one point I make, and I've got on some other slides, but I think I'm going to sort of go beyond or skip over a lot of that so I can talk about the design principles briefly before I have to stop, is that this research for the first time captures the values and the symbols and the norms of the institutions in which we are embedded. I wrote an article with the late Lyman Porter, who's the person I think who created the idea of job satisfaction. So if you've heard of job satisfaction, you know about Lyman Porter's work. Lyman and I wrote an article published in the Academy of Management Review in 1982. And one of the things we talked about was the fact that almost all the research is done in industrial contexts. So what we know about motivation had nothing to do with what we learned from studying government. And it wasn't until the research on public service motivation came along that we pushed our colleagues in other areas, and this is the other reason why sort of the slide refers to theoretical. If you look at the research now, economists are doing research on altruism. They call it public service motivation. Social psychologists are doing research on pro-social motivation. It basically relates very closely to public service motivation. Sociologists are doing research in this area. So sort of a key idea is that this research is coherent both with respect to the institutions that are our focus and that are most consequential for us, and a body of theory coming from at least 4 or 5 different disciplines, including public administration, that really, I think, sort of sheds some light on the motivational calculus, the motivational equation for people in public service. Okay, so how much time have I used? I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to, like I say, I made...
Yes, you...
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm going to skip about 3 slides here, but let me talk a little bit about aligning institutions, individuals, and incentives. One area that I've done a lot of research in is pay for performance. Now, pay for performance is the biggest fake, I'm using a Donald Trump term, fake on the sort of our intellectual integrity that ever came along. But it's a great example of the problem of misalignment. We bring people to public service, or people come to public service. Why? Because they may want to do good for their fellow citizen. They're certainly not there to line their pockets unless they're on the take. Now, I can't speak to that very directly, but maybe some of you folks may know more about that than I do. But the reality is that people come to service for, noble and good reasons often. And then we say, hey, we're going to start paying you based on the job you do, the level of performance, and we're going to translate all that good you do into money. Now that's a big turnoff. It's a big misalignment of what the individual motives are and the organizational incentives. But that keeps getting imposed on the organization. Why? Because people in the legislature or elsewhere believe that that's what works. Now, I've done enough research on performance pay in the public sector to know that $1.98, every extra $1.98, this is American dollars, every 2 weeks, I don't know what that translates into in Kazakh money, but it's not much, even though you got 300 or 400 to the dollar. It's like 700 of your currency. Isn't much money, and people aren't going to sort of jump through hoops for that. But the other aspect of that is it ignores the nature of our institutions. Performance pay and high salaries for senior executives makes great sense if you're running the Trump organization, or if you're running a private enterprise where you may have unlimited resources from the widgets or whatever it is you make that you sell. It doesn't work in the budget-constrained environment of public service. And we've known that. The interesting thing is we've been hoodwinked. Because when I first started doing research on performance pay, and I'd say, well, and one of the studies was published in 1985 in Academy of Management Journal, the most respected management journal, and it won an award from the Society for Human Resource Management. We got $5,000 for best article. But when we talked to people about the article, they said, well, it didn't come out right and people weren't motivated because it's government. You must not have implemented it correctly. And we repeatedly would run these experiments or run these evaluations of performance pay, and they'd say, you must have done something wrong because it works everywhere else. Well, first of all, I don't believe it works everywhere else, and we've subsequently gotten evidence since the 80s about where it does and doesn't work. But there's a lot of secrecy in the private sector about performance pay. It fits the institutions. Secrecy is not something that we can live with in the public sector. Transparency is sort of the coin of the realm. And certainly citizens want to know where their money is going. And if we're giving it to a bureaucrat, they want to know how much that bureaucrat is getting and why. And this is a key reason why performance pay keeps failing, but it's probably the classic example of people being sold a bill of goods about a particular management practice that doesn't work, that's misaligned. It misaligns the institutions and the organizations. It misaligns the individuals and the incentives. And so it's been a failure. It's a failure fundamentally and at its core, and not simply because we're just incapable of implementing it correctly. That's a lot of baloney. Now, baloney is probably as strong a word as I will use today. Okay. Now, let me sort of skip so the argument I make in the paper is institutions, individuals, and incentives are sort of key components of thinking about motivation in the public context. The other thing that I think is important to think about is that when I was a new faculty member and when I was a graduate student, we would talk about individuals and organizations. The individual has to fit the organization has to fit the individual. We never talked about institutions. I think one thing that the public service motivation research has brought us, and the research on altruism and pro-social behavior, is that it said we need to think about the institutional rules. We need to think about the norms because they are relevant too. And if we ignore those, we ignore powerful sources of influence on individual behavior. And that's sort of a key point, I think, coming out of this research over a period of many years. Now, I've got 8 design principles here, and I want to sort of run through them quickly, but I will try to explain them briefly enough to get through them quickly, but also substantially enough that you'll be able to ask me questions about them if they're sort of critical or if you think that there's some bad ideas here. First of all, attract high public service motivation employees. Doing so has consequences for employee performance and agency mission accomplishment. Now, we haven't translated, for instance, the Russian and Ukraine research on high public service motivation employees being less likely to be corrupt. But if that's the case, then we have a sort of we make the case for this design characteristic. It's not to say we want people who are good from the perspective of their public service motivation. Just think of all the people we could get in the bureaucracy. People who have a high public service motivation and they're committed to their fellow citizens. People who are lazy and know that they will not be called out for their lack of performance. People who want a job for life and know that the job security system in the government organization will basically sort of save them from having to account for their behavior. The reality is that unless we pay attention to these individual characteristics, we're going to lose out. We're going to lose out on getting the best people for the organization, people who perform well, and people who behave reliably and ethically. So that's sort of, I think, an important cornerstone of the design principles. And to be honest, and I've spent a lot of time in Korea, this is my first trip to Kazakhstan, I would have these conversations with Korean colleagues. They would give people the Goshi exam. Now, if you know anything about Korea, you know that the demand to take the Goshi exam increased 1,000% between 1997, 1998, and the end of the next decade. Why? Because parents would tell their kids, we had an economic crisis here, we had high levels of unemployment, go to government, you can get that and keep that job. But do I want a lot of people who are trying to protect their job in my government organization, in my government unit? Or do I want people who are there because they want to make a difference for their society? So we need to get better at selecting in people and also excluding other people who want to enter our civil service. Now, one of the problems, I had in a conversation yesterday, one of the problems of our sort of classic thinking about civil service systems is examinations for the job. I don't think examinations for the job get us to where we want to be. We need to go beyond examining for the job. We need to go, I might call it the character of the employees, maybe the long-term viability of their staying with government. Clearly, one of the things that happens is if we get people who don't have a strong commitment to the values and norms of the government organizations they join, is that once they get some experience, they're ready to go to the private sector where they can get more pay. And they'll gladly do that because that's what they're interested in. Do we want those people to begin with? Probably not. As long as we can get people who can do the job, who have other goals in their lives, including sort of serving their communities, serving their country, doing a duty for their fellow citizens. Those are the people we want, but we need to find ways of honing in on those individuals. Okay, second is supportive work environment reinforces public service motivation. In the one sort of idea that I would associate with this, and for those of you familiar with self-determination theory talks about these fundamental psychological needs. And this fundamental psychological needs are relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And what we want is we want to provide environments, and I think we can do that by emphasizing sort of the connection between our managerial activities and public service motivation. We want to create environments where people feel competent, they can work autonomously, and they are also related to the people around them, both in their unit and maybe outside the unit. So those are sort of the second design principle is one that I think we can draw directly out of self-determination theory, and it's related to serving fundamental psychological needs. A third element, we have a lot of experimental evidence on this, is identify beneficiaries of jobs and organizational missions, creating opportunities for direct contacts between employees and beneficiaries. I translate this to two words, or at least in my book I translate this to two words. Public work. Public work is often, or work is often, and tasks are allocated to governments. Why? Because they can't be done in the private sector. And there are lots of things, whether it's policing, whether it's firefighting, whether it's national security and defense, that are unique to the government enterprise. Let's find ways of translating the significance of that work to the activities of our employees. And in doing so, we're going to retain those people are going to perform at a higher level, and they will perform more reliably. I think we already know that from the research evidence. Okay, 3 design principles related to incentives, and one of these, the first one has already been touched on, I think, by our UNDP regional representative, Mariana. Government organizations should emphasize low-powered rather than high-powered incentives. We spent a lot of time during the new public management, that era from the late 70s to the late the late 20th century, late 1900s, on trying to create high-powered incentives. High-powered incentives, as Mariana indicated, UNDP already knows they don't work very well for a variety of reasons. One is they're inconsistent with the motives of the individuals in the organization, so there's not a good fit, not a good alignment between the organizational incentive and the individual motives. The other reason they don't fit very well is because our government institutions don't generate the funds to adequately support the financial requirements of these high-powered systems. But there are lots of low-powered things, recognition or other forms of attention to good performance by employees that we can attend to, and we need to do that. Another one, and this is sort of saying do no harm, avoid incentives that crowd out public service motivation. We should also seek to crowd in pro-social intrinsic autonomous motivation. That comes both from the social psychological research out of self-determination theory, as well as something called motivation crowding out of economics. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to have people who have a high-quality public service motivation, who are altruistic, who are pro-social, and say, we're not interested in that. Let's drive that out. What we want to do is we want to reinforce that if at all possible. So we don't want to do harm with the incentives we create. We certainly don't want to crowd out the more powerful motives. And then another one, and I'm interested in hearing what people have to say about the compensation redesign. And this is based on a paper I delivered in China in December. Total compensation is the appropriate benchmark for external comparisons. We had the one example about the social policy, the social welfare program, where it's not as good in the public sector as in the private. Well, maybe they need to be reconciled. Maybe we need to bring it up, level the playing field, so that the total compensation for government employees is not something that will drive them to go to the private sector to get adequate recognition for their work. I say that with having a Master of Social Work graduate in my family. My 41-year-old daughter moved from the public sector to the private because they pay her better there. But she still does the same work. But she couldn't get the recognition in the public sector. But that's pretty common. We need the other sort of side of this, the other reason I refer to total compensation, is the tendency in some jurisdictions, certainly the U.S. is one that's guilty of doing it, is that we give people compensation on the par with the private sector, and then we give them nice pensions. So they do a lot better in the government sector. The question is that what we want to do? And of course, my view is that that's inconsistent with this notion of public service motivation, and service being sort of a core value, a core norm of what we do in public administration. Two additional principles, and I think they've been touched on already to some extent. Provide opportunities for newcomers to learn about organizational values and expectations for employee behavior that reflects public service values. We can't assume that everybody that comes to government already buys into the sort of the public service motives and the public service values. So we need to do some socializing. And that's through orientation programs, onboarding programs, and others. There's some great examples of onboarding programs that have been used to sort of bring people along to see the culture and the values of the public organization. And we need to broaden that sort of perspective. And then finally, and this is where I think it goes back to the title for this session, develop leaders who communicate and model public service values via organizational mission and vision. Somebody said something similar to this earlier, but as I'm writing this book, the word that keeps popping into my mind is mission. We need to be able to articulate our missions, get people excited about those missions, communicate them honestly, but get people fixated on what it is that this organization is all about and what difference it makes. And that, I think, is one of the keys to generating high quality performance, reliable performance, and continuing performance from individuals we draw to our organizations. So, conclusion. We have a critical mass of research. Let's not ignore it. I'm writing and editing a book now that's going to be published in September in honor of Paul Volcker by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And the idea is that we have a dearth of intellectual capital. That was a point represented in my emails with some of the authors. I don't buy that idea. I believe that what we need to do is read the stuff that's already out there. Somebody needs to go to that list of 500 public service motivation sources, read the research on altruism, read the research on pro-social behavior, and before you know it, you'll have plenty intellectual capital to begin changing civil service systems. A key to civil service system, though, is aligning public institutions' individual motives and organizational incentives. Hopefully, when I finish this book, I will be able to sort of convince you that we can do that without sort of doing somersaults or twisting like a pretzel, that this is possible. And I think it's sort of just requires some sort of simple values to be embedded in the way we think about our public service. And then finally, pursuing the principles positions government globally to fulfill aspirations of their citizens for a better quality of life. This is certainly a point that comes out in the public passion documents, which are available online, that are intended in part to support the Sustainable Development Goals. But I believe in that, and I think there's evidence to support it. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
We are grateful. We are grateful to you, Professor Perry, for sharing your knowledge. Yes, you may sit, please. Thank you. As we are 40 minutes beyond the planned time, I would like to suggest to move the discussion with Professor Perry at the end of our session, where we have special time for discussions and Q&A. Now, I would like to give the next floor to Ms. Raisova, please.
Құрметті әріптестер, уважаемые участники.
Dear participants, the topic of my research is how corporate culture motivates employees in Kazakhstani organizations. So it's entirely my view. So there are wonderful words of Peter Drucker. Culture eats a strategy for breakfast. I think that you are well aware about this phrase, and the strongest motivator in the work of employees is not only salaries, bonuses, and social packages, but the current corporate culture of the organization. And it could be a demotivator as well. As a reference, I can make a reference. 5 years ago, working in a large national holding, I participated to the transformation process of the company. And within this transformation program, we have participated with together with my colleagues. We've been working on business processes model. We brought and approved new standards, including new personnel, and we changed nice roadmaps for transformation. And at the same time, we felt that we had missed something, because the processes described well did not work in full. And the new business model were much better on the paper. And when we looked at the issue, we came up to the necessity to work with the corporate culture. So the question is how to diagnose the culture. And we see that many items from the roadmap that I have mentioned not always lead to a result that we have anticipated in the beginning. And based on what I said, I used to be working for 15 years in this quasi-state sector, and I had a chance to look at our consultants, at our experts of both Kazakh and international, and looking at those surveys made for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, there were no major changes in the results of these diagnostics. During the time, strategies, managers, employees, performance indicators changed, but the leadership style remained. The level of staff engagement and the recommendations of the consultants to strengthen the team style and interaction remained virtually unchanged. And there was something very stable and unchanging in this data. And we began to study the methods suggested by Robert Quinn. And he has provided the 4 types of culture and invited him to speak. So therefore, the 4 layers of culture included family, hierarchy, market, and project. According to this series, the basis of the development of a company is a change in the corporate culture. And we have to look at the ambitions of the people at the end result. So we're talking about the project type culture. So certainly the culture itself can be characterized by many layers. And if we go back to the surveys of 18 and 19, in 99% of cases, we have identified the following profile of the culture. Look at the 4 types of culture that I have discussed, and the desired culture program, the rules-based culture is prevailing. So everyone is putting the responsibility to somebody else's shoulders. And furthermore, you see the current existing culture and the we're saying about the fact that we're not that the current hierarchy doesn't prevail in all of the cases, but there's a gap in between the current and the desired culture. So, however, most organizations often declare strategies aimed at high competitiveness and achieving ambitious results, and therefore they would require the market cultures. And the dissonance demotivates employees. And what makes it more interesting that it's almost in conjunction. And again, the surveys were made at the joint stock companies, and the form of ownership was very, very important. And they were, as I said, aimed at high performance, at high outcome. And at the same time, a culture of rules as an organization often works not in a constructive manner, but rather in mimicry, in depth, to represent a culture of power, since the rules exist on paper, but in life what happens is said by the manager. And in case if we look at the KPI, for instance, the KPI is often set by the management, and the high performance is one of the KPIs that has been traditionally proposed. This culture isn't going to be supported by the employees, by the ordinary employees of the company. And that was one of the conclusions that we made. And what makes it more interesting is the service that we had in Russia. And they looked at 6 types of culture. Not in our case, we looked at 4 types of culture. And they looked closely at the profile of family to find out whether they can exist in parallel or not. And as I have discovered, in 80% of Russian organizations, they still used to be having the manager-based culture. So my opinion is that despite the fact that we have the culture of rules, then we still don't have it actually. Don't have it to its full pledge, and there are a lot more projects that we unsuccessful in terms of cultural development compared to successful ones. But the fact that we discussed with managers the behavior of their employees, their processes, developing the required culture, as well as measuring the dynamics of development, gives us a hope that the systemic and concise work with the corporate culture will lead to increased motivation and involvement of employees, as well as to achievement of organization's objectives. We have to be appreciating our employees for being creative, for instance, and in order to look at the long-term motivation, we have to look at the culture of the organizations. And certainly you can go deep into lots of service. However, we need to change. And the culture depends on the style of leadership. You have to be demonstrated not only 2 types of styles of management. You need to demonstrating, let's say, 6 or more. When we used to be working with the corporate culture, we need to communicate and administer. And secondly, the critical mass of people is supporting this culture. And we certainly need to change physically the people. We might have people who don't know. Push the. We need to push those people who have a socially important kinds of behavior. And if we come up to a critical mass of people, those who have been left are going to be concentrating on the material remuneration issues. We miss the behavior. However, remuneration needs to be based on the targets, on the objectives the organization has, and it shouldn't be concentrated on the performance solely. Therefore, the comprehension of remuneration and the shift of behavior again belongs to the theorists, and this could bring us to the better. And we can hire the best people. However, traditionally, if we still have very old-fashioned business processes, then it's impossible to achieve any high-performance results.
Now, please let me kindly give the floor to Mr. Nair.
My perspective is a private sector perspective. I based my discussion entirely on the work that I did for multinational corporations when I was running my own company. We took a stake in a New York was an investor relations firm. There are a few takeaways from them. One is that in a merger and acquisitions, staff are severely affected. Management is excited because they're bringing two companies together, and the process, there will be a great contribution to the bottom line. Their focus will be on shareholders, on the markets, the investors. But the employers are not equally excited. The employers are badly affected. In fact, the first thing they do when they go and they will talk to the investment market, they will talk to the shareholders, they will go internationally to the international investors. So in this point of time, however, a team is put together, usually forming a change or reorganization. And that core team will involve the HR supported by the communications chief or team. Now, what has come through over the years is that it's not entirely based on all the merger and acquisitions they found, for example, the focus is not on shareholders. And even Jack Welch, Jack Ma have come up to the conclusion, shareholder value is a result, not a strategy. Your main constituency are your employees. And this is the point when motivation is at the lowest. You are bringing in two companies together, invariably you will find people losing their jobs. They will find, for example, two departments from different organizations coming together, there's replication. So this is the level that we're talking about when motivation is very low, and what do you do about it? Now, Jack Ma himself says that the customers are number one, employees are number two, shareholders number three. This is the turn or change in the way corporates are looking at employees, that you cannot ignore employees in the course of running your business. Now, thinking in the context of civil service, we are talking about the higher purpose. In the civil service, we're talking about the advancing the public cause. I think a lot of discussion has been talked about the public cause, how important it is to think beyond the organization. Why are you in the civil service? If you read through the executive summary done by the hub itself, the colleagues are more trusted. A very important line is that somehow in Kazakhstan, you find that your colleagues are more important than your superiors. That there is also a strong family atmosphere that's focused within the workforce. So the intrinsic factors seem to be stronger based on the executive summary that was presented or made available, at least by what I saw. Now, this is an example of a higher purpose, that you go beyond your salaries and your promotions and focus more on this one. Now, a growing number in the private sector are also looking at the higher purpose. It is not a side issue or a fluffy topic. It is central to the culture of the company. I think culture has been brought up continuously. The people and customers are part of the strategy of the organization. Now, to do that, the CEO is automatically a cheerleader. He's vested, he's deeply invested in seeing that it's successful. He may or may not be the number one, he may be number two, but somewhere along the line, the chairman, the CEO, the top management are assured of a place there, and therefore they are continuously saying, how do we go forward and what do we do about it? Now, on the other hand, the staff are not that equally excited. They are uncertain about their future. They're not sure where things are going, in what direction. Where will they be still in the job, or will they have lost the job? So in this context, we are talking about how well do you communicate. I think we talked about the mission that James himself talked about, saying that the company's mission and the vision must be communicated internally. How well the change is needed and why. How well the employees have brought this into their work. All these things come into place at the time of a merger and acquisition. Similarly, for example, in one of the cases we do is when there's a crisis situation. We find, for example, the same situation required when, say, I was involved in a case where there was an airplane crash and the senior management, some of them died in the process. Again, how do you go around galvanizing the staff while they are in a state of grieving? So in both the case of merger and acquisition or in the case of critical situations, the management of the staff becomes a very critical part. And for that, we need to find, or I use the word, cheerleaders. As I mentioned to you, cheerleaders, top management have no problems in getting the cheerleaders. Can you find the cheerleaders among your staff? That is a challenge posed for the HR or for the management itself. Can you find people who believe in the organization and the things they're serving, the higher purpose in the organization, and share it within? So it's not entirely top-down, but it's also within where peers identify. That is hardly mentioned, but in the private sector, they actually invest a lot of time in identifying staff who actually play a role in motivating or actually talking to their colleagues to say, this is the purpose, let's move on and let's do something about it. In fact, As I mentioned earlier, within Kazakhstan, you do have actually a culture where colleagues want to help one another strongly in comparison to advancing, with a view to advance the public cause and not entirely their personal career. Who are the cheerleaders? There are 4 definitions of people within an organization. There are 4 types of staff within the organization. The first category will be the cheerleaders, people who spread the ideas, who tell what should be done with the organization, why the organization should do what it's doing, why things are doing well. In effect, they're both high-tech and high-touch. One thing I observed in Kazakhstan on campus is that how people actually move around, there's a lot of touch. As you see people walking around, suddenly they see a friend, they walk out, touch the friend, hug him, or do a handshake, and they come back to the group and move on. This constant touch seems to be a part of this culture that is unique. I have never seen this anywhere in the world, that you are quite a high-touch organization. However, within the organization, you have, besides cheerleaders and champions, that you can find people with a high touch, will be agnostics. Three-quarters of the people, or most of the people actually, will be agnostics. They're not interested. They're not committed. And most people will fall within this group. They are cynics. They will only criticize. Most of the ideas, they don't feel the change is relevant to them. They don't want to be supported by the change. And the third thing will be the fourth category, but saboteurs, who turn around and say all the negative of the organization. Unfortunately, you are dealing with this kind of staff. So in the private sector, these things exist. I think it exists probably in a greater way in the public sector. Now, what's very interesting about cheerleaders is that the tech companies, private sector tech companies, have changed it completely. You have now, for example, let's take Google's. Within the C-suite now, you have a chief happiness officer. He's actually a cheerleader. That you have this guy by the name of Tan Chengde Ming was actually appointed as the chief happiness officer, which means on par with the CEO. He's actually a Singaporean, surprisingly, running these things and all that. So, and right now they've written a book called Delivering Happiness. This whole, and there's also an index called Happiness, Happy Planet Index. All these things are focused on motivating and engaging employees. In short, this whole concept of identifying cheerleaders within an organization is actually growing in importance in the private sector. It's already very important within the high-tech private sector, but I think it's time maybe the public sector should consider this element within. That means it's better for people to, especially as I told you in the culture of Kazakhstan, based on the report, the superiors don't have the same kind of respect or the same kind of impact as peers. So you should therefore capitalize on this unique situation. Invariably, one reason why we saw the 4 categories, and most of the people are within the agnostics and the skeptics categories, is that because people are not employed. Therefore, you need to identify employees who can be empowered to play a role that is that impacts on the rest of their colleagues and their peers. So when you talk about rallying the troops, this is a concept within the private sector. They actually understand the importance of getting people harnessed together and move on. And it's a regular thing. And within this, the HR should play a role in bringing about this change, the top management, the HR, and they must increase. The whole objective is, can you increase the number of people who can be within these employee cheerleaders? Remember, the bulk of them will not within these categories. You're going to have difficulties in finding these categories. But that will be the challenge if you can do that in the public sector. What does that mean? It means, in the change team, spending time to understand others' perspective, listening with open mind and without judgment, encouraging others to voice their opinions and what they care about. Now, all these things sound very esoteric or hardly present in the public sector, but actually it's become a major factor within. The organizations that I used to do consultancy with actually play a lot of, for example, American Express, most of the card companies. This is a major factor when they are doing their various product promotions and all that. Looking at the staff and how they contribute to helping one another. A team that's found in one country will go to another country and support the country within when they're doing a new product launch. It's that kind of continuous movement globally too. The sense of finding a change team. When they bring about change in, say, a new product launch, they bring the change stream from the other country into the new country itself. So the whole approach is very different. Change is part and parcel of encouraging the organization to move forward. And so encourage others to voice their opinions, why expressing new ideas, anticipate how others will react to them. All these things are part and parcel of a private sector approach to change management. Now, another thing is when you have identified your cheerleaders, you must spend time with the cheerleaders. The cheerleaders are actually chosen and become almost like, they may or may not be within HR. For example, the person mentioned in Google, Tan, he himself was actually an engineer. For 10 years he was an engineer. Then he moved over because he had that passion. There's something he believed in. So harnessing such people and doing things to support them play a very important part. I think you will find Malcolm Caldwell's book, The Tipping Point. It's a very good book to read. And one of the things you find, for example, one category is influentials. Influentials are cheerleaders. Usually informed, persuasive, well-connected. You need to identify these people. Not everybody's like that. And so the thing is that the HR needs to identify the people who are influential because they may be outspoken, they may be gregarious, they're always around talking, mixing around. They could be introspective. They don't have to be that kind of category. They could be quiet, but they are most important of all these categories, whether they are central members of a particular group, or they're innovators, or they're laggards. The central feature is that they are part of a network. They can build a network. They know a lot of people. When you ask them something, they will make an effort to find out and tell you who they should talk to. These are the people who are really cheerleaders or the influentials within an organization. And as mentioned to you, they are very strong in terms of not only now, both high touch, it means in touch people, but there's also high tech. They're also connected through technology. So the point is that delivering within the private sector technology companies, it falls within the concept of harnessing happiness or delivering happiness. Now, what else do you do to encourage your cheerleaders? You empower them. You celebrate their successes. Every time something is done, you bring them up together. You have events, functions, special events for them, bring them together. In fact, it's found that if you put them, for example, let's say the engineering terms are going for a leadership retreat. You put your cheerleader there. He moves around and identifies what are the things that are required by the engineering staff, what are the demands, requirements, why they're leaving, what's the demotivators and the motivators. That is part of the function of the use of a cheerleader within an organization. So you will find that he's given more responsibilities, more interesting things to be done because he knows that the higher cost, the more important things for the company is what is going to be done with a mission and vision in mind. So if you have problems, so there's a lot of rewards, creative rewards that are even audited. In Singapore, we actually have some arrangements through corporate awards for private sector where we have a major event and they're all evaluated from the private sector where people have PwC's, Deloitte doing these assessments. So the first thing is to move away from the old command and control model towards a stronger employer engagement, but it's easier said than done. Most organizations talk about employee engagement, employee empowerment, they hardly bother to move forward. Let me summarize by saying that now 50 years ago, no one predicted that people will, we didn't expect that so much technology and technological tools being used in your workforce. You find, for example, that almost all the skills now, whether it's banking, can you imagine banking, lawyers, advertising, healthcare, are all intruded by technology. So this becomes part and parcel of how do you go around harnessing technology within this cheerleader or this whole approach to motivating staff. The fourth industrial generation, everybody's talking about it. I mean, in Singapore, we talked to the point that I'm from Singapore, and we are now within the civil service now, they have employed Singularity University to motivate or to at least to bring these higher from the top level all the way down to the most senior staff on how to bring about change. So recently, this Singularity University came and talked to all the top civil servants, followed by all the top government-linked companies, then all the private sector, and then going down to all the staff within or senior management in all these sectors in order to tell them there must be change. Now, in a sense, if you look back, it's like cheerleading. You're getting a third party to bring about, to say what must be done, what must be changes in the light of, we talked about VUCA world, we talked about fourth industrial revolutions, all these things are there, but at the end of the day, the change comes with the people, the individuals involved. So we must therefore look at the staff itself. Amidst all the jargon of 4.0, education 4.0, talent 4.0, society 4.0, there's so much along these lines and all that. But there's so much wild cards, things that you do not know. Things, you know wild cards. Wild cards are things that are known. You know, you can predict certain level of prediction. Black swans, you don't even know it hits you. Leaders are bearing this in mind. So when they look at their staff, if you do not have a good staff, if you don't have a highly motivated staff, you will find, for example, that you cannot go around bringing change within the organization. And because it's so difficult to identify change with everybody, you need to identify a core group of people whom we call cheerleaders or influentials. So my conclusion will be that at the end of the day, I think this whole part of the discussion focus on identifying people who in the private sector consider as cheerleaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nair. Now, let me please give the floor to Mr. Panas Liverakis.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Tok-san. I will only cover the basic points of this draft paper, as I only have 10 minutes to present, and I intend to stick to that. However, whoever is interested to indulge further, please ask me for a copy. I will share with you, as long as you will provide me with your comments and suggestions for improving it. So I'd like to start with the definition of total compensation. And in this context, I'm using a model which is developed by the OECD and which captures the different dimensions of public sector compensation. It encompasses 4 aspects: pay, benefits, learning and development, and working environment. Some of these aspects, as it's clearly illustrated, are tangible and others are intangible. Some involve the individual and the others the group. What each one of them contains is very clearly depicted in the graph. What I like to highlight here is that it is very important to define total compensation. And it has to be widely accepted somehow because it's a crucial issue in many aspects. For instance, a decision on what components, elements to include in the total compensation package for public sector employees will determine the level of parity or disparity with compensation packages in the private sector. More will be said on this issue later when external fairness of compensation is briefly touched upon. Another very relevant aspect of public sector compensation is its size. It's usually measured as a proportion of the gross domestic product and of government expenditures. The overall size of the public sector compensation bill is important, and let me elaborate. Changes in salaries, pensions, and other employment conditions have an impact on government budgets, workforce composition, and service delivery levels. On the other hand, on the flip side, budgetary and fiscal constraints will influence decisions on the size of compensation and employment levels. If there is no consistency with overall financial objectives, any changes in the compensation package will have crucial macroeconomic and fiscal consequences. The graph shows you that the world average of the public sector compensation stands at 6.3% of GDP in 2016. However, in order to understand its true meaning, one should consider it along other areas, such as the share of GDP devoted to health, education, defense expenditures, or whatever other policy area you may think of. Same graph, but this time applied to the size of the public compensation sector in selected countries of the region. A clarification, the countries of the region have not been selected deliberately, but they were only a result of what data was available. As you can see, Kazakhstan seems to appears to devote a much smaller share of the GDP for public sector compensation. However, the differences, I suspect, they are attributed to methodological differences that exist, and which is also very problematic when tries to compare percentages across countries. So we are actually looking into it further, trying to discern why there is such a big difference, not only from the average for the region, but also from the world average. Same story about expenditures. The world average stands at 25.2% again in 2016, but once again you would look at it at the size of the government expenditures in relation to other expenditures of the government in other policy areas. Same thing again for the region. As you can see, in countries in the region, the average is much smaller than the world, only 14.5%. And again, despite the methodological issues discussed, there may be several other reasons why this is the case. Again, this is also a subject of the ongoing research. Now, another important aspect of public sector compensation is the fairness of the compensation system in place. Fairness of the system can be distinguished in two ways, external and internal. External fairness denotes that public workers' employment conditions and rewards for their engagement is analogous to those workers in the private and non-governmental sectors. Assessing external fairness entails considering the extent of alignment to what competing employers, public and private, in the public and private sectors, pay to attract and retain employees who have similar skills and responsibilities to perform a job. On the other side, internal fairness signifies whether the pay differential among all employees is aligned to each position within an organization fairly. In our case, to assess the external and internal fairness of the public sector compensation systems, we looked at two areas only. One was the compensation levels between the public and the private sector, and for the second case, the compression ratio of compensation within the public sector. Now, the comparability of public versus private pay is a major issue. Many studies argue that public sector employees are paid less than those in the private sector, controlling for education and work experience. And more or less, this is accepted by most researchers. However, researchers' views differ on the extent to which pensions and other monetary and non-monetary benefits compensate for the difference. For example, pensions are perceived to be more generous in the public sector. Some studies suggest that the total compensation over the life cycle of workers is equalized, and this graph is trying to capture the progression and what the comparison is throughout the work life of a person. Yet other studies conclude that public sector employees' compensation demonstrates a clear advantage if calculated over the lifestyle, and although it's lower in monetary terms, the size of the total remuneration is higher, generally higher. And in other cases, again, that's based on evidence, on research, if we include the cost of benefits such as health insurance, pension plans, etc., sometimes it's 10% higher than the private sector in the work life of a public employee. Now, internal fairness, as I said, it's defined by the compression ratio, and it's a difference between the highest and lowest paid employees. The OECD defines the compression ratio in the public sector as the ratio between the median pay of the top and bottom 10% of workers in order to exclude any outliers that may exist. So we think this ratio is a useful indicator of the adequacy of pay. Now, the meaning of this, a low ratio may suggest that highly skilled workers are underpaid while unskilled workers are overpaid. That's one view. Second view is that the lower the ratio, the more equitable the pay is between the different grades within the public sector. The average compression ratio, as you can see in this slide for all OECD member states, is 4.39 to 1, meaning that compensation at the top of the grade scale is 4.39 times the compensation at the bottom of the grade scale. A cluster of countries appear to have a compression ratio below the OECD average. Greece, as you can see, Norway, Iceland, Austria, Netherlands, etc. And as I said, in some cases, these compression ratios may be interpreted as being more equitable, but again, that's something debatable, and there's more discussion about this in the paper. There are also other countries that are well above the OECD average: Italy, Australia, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, which is a real outlier. I think it's on this slide. I couldn't fit everything on one. Let me see. Oops, sorry. Is Mexico there? Yeah, Mexico, 10.02. But again, it is something that we're still researching because, as I said in the beginning, it is very difficult, because of the data that exists, to be able to tell what is included and what is excluded from the calculations for this data to come up, for these results to come up, rather. I plan to conclude, and therefore I would like to tell you a few what the trends are, or they seem to be, in public sector compensation. One thing for sure is that public sector compensation systems have started changing because governments have been forced to introduce policies that restructure the way work is compensated, as well as how the total awards are organized and managed, driven mainly by austerity measures and cost control needs. And what is emerging, it represents, in many respects, a significant departure from conventional thinking. Right-sizing, downsizing, right-sizing, a term referring to initiatives intended to determine optimal staffing configurations, and it seems to be adopted quite a lot. Although the end result of these right-sizing exercises lead to downsizing of the public sector workforce. You may know this process. This process, government departments, agencies are subjected to function reviews, organizational restructuring, often eliminating or redefining jobs and layers of management, and job descriptions are subjected to review and reassignment to salary grades anew. upwards or downwards. Additionally, public organizations are defining their core functions and changing their views about what they should do themselves as part of a change taking place in public service provision modalities. This has resulted to a significant increase in joint initiatives and close collaboration with the private sector. In some cases, and that's, I think, one important aspect that I walked away with, is that such collaboration is creating new organizations which draw on multiple workforces from the private and public sector, and thus they need, and usually is the case, a new and unified approach to compensation. In other words, these new organizations construct their own grade scales and compensation schemes, which may differ a lot from current ones in the public or the private sector. However, we cannot evaluate such initiatives because they do take time to mature. They require a shift in the balance of the workforce. They require new skill sets and a different culture and behavior, which needs to be supported and reinforced through this new compensation framework, and it takes some time to see the results. Now, much to the disappointment of Professor Perry, one of the trends that is actually quite strong is linking performance pay with performance, linking employee pay with performance in the public sector. This approach, fortunately or unfortunately, is increasingly common for managers and professional staff. Under various schemes which have been introduced, compensation is adjusted to reflect the assessed level of individual performance or group performance and the results achieved, with higher ratings usually receiving higher rewards. Overall, even though some problems have arisen and that few countries claim to have made a success of the practice, it seems that the transition to performance-related pay will continue in earnest, given the persistent focus on government performance. Reactions, of course, have been registered against these approaches, and they're quite acceptable and understandable, because they reflect the difficulties, and this was also mentioned by some of our colleagues today, of setting personal objectives in some roles in the public sector, let alone measuring them. Again, a fuller discussion on the issue, it's in the paper, a whole section is devoted to that. Another trend is individualized pay. Individualized pay for public employees who possess skills and competencies which are in high demand. And it seems to be something that will continue because considering that knowledge-based jobs are on the rise, public employers are introducing compensation policies that recognize the value of those suitably qualified workers with higher compensation. And there are many examples of that, even in Europe. For example, Portugal is paying a high premium, a premium of about 25%, because it is suffering from a severe shortage of IT people. Nearly 60% of the OECD countries provide such special allowances to attract people, and some 35% of them have actually separate pay scales. One more trend is we witness, although it's not very evident, it's mostly evident in countries with Anglo-Saxon tradition and position-based systems. It is not so much spread in countries with career-based systems. This is delegation of responsibility from a central authority to ministries and agencies. In some cases, as I said again, this responsibility is delegated even lower to the level of line managers and supervisors. However, this approach requires that performance systems, at least for the managers, are linked to the performance of their organizations. And I would like to close this presentation by saying that an overall trend that we found is a move towards flatter and more flexible organizational designs and compensation structures that are integrated and harmonized across different staff groups and fewer grades generally composed of wide compensation bands. Furthermore, job evaluation is increasingly being used in the public sector, although in a simplified form, to determine compensation levels. And also, in relation to the last one, one observes a growing interest in the use of skills and competencies approach in compensation, along with the functional responsibilities and the position of a job within an organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liverakis. Dear speakers, we are grateful to you for your presentations that were valuable and remarkable. And now the floor is open for discussions, for questions and answer session. And I would recommend, could you please, dear guests, just identify who do you address your questions, please. Қазір сұрақ пен жауап сессиясы.
We're going to have a Q&A session right now. If you have questions to our speakers, please don't hesitate and ask our speakers. I would like to ask you in advance to tell whom you would address your issues. Thank you. Kulmira Kurganbayeva, Almaty Management University, President. The question to the three key main speakers. You have told that we need to change the mindset. It goes without saying that cultural change is a complex issue. You need to have special set of tools and processes. Perhaps you would need to have years spent for that or decades. In your opinion, taking into account what's been said, how the state service needs to be related to the educational system, because the mindset change is a time-consuming process, as I said. I would support you entirely, and my personal experience demonstrates that culture is an attitude, and as an attitude is a habit. Although if we have leaders who declare themselves being democratic, in fact, this may eventually lead to an autocratic style. So therefore, in case if we bring up the students and make sure that they do have much more extended habits and behaviors, this is going to be their traditional behaviors. So those people, once they become the leaders, talking to their for instance, to their leaders, they're going to be demonstrating great results from a behavioral standpoint. And certainly, culture is a very complex process, and very, very time-consuming. I would support what you said.
You're right, it's going to take a long time to change the culture. That is, we're talking about, I mean, if we look back at the Civil Service Reform Act, which started the pay-for-performance idea, it took 25 years to diffuse across the OECD countries. That wasn't until about 2005 or so. Now, a lot of countries claim to do it. but they may claim to do it, but they may not. But, you know, the timelines are long. We're talking about 25 to 50 years. We're talking about sort of a commitment over a long term. You know, I think two things that have to happen is, one, civil services have to come up with a meaningful leadership development strategy to change the way people in the current civil servants behave, particularly at the top levels of the organization. They also may have to make a commitment, I think, like Kazakhstan has done, to developing people who are going to be coming up through the system, to make sure you've got quality staff who are capable of populating the civil service. So I wouldn't expect overnight success, and I would sort of expect commitment for the long term. I think the other thing you got to think about is, what are the strategic changes you need to make that are going to sort of help drive the cultural change? And once you identify those and implement them, then you might sort of begin to get sort of a rising tide that will sort of bring you to cultural change. Now, the other thing is that as the speaker on Rosina? Yeah. Commented, you know, there are different cultures across these organizations, so culture is not going to be uniform. But I think we need to think about what kind of culture will sort of solidify the consistencies across the civil service in ways that are consistent with sort of our long-term goals. You're still going to get variations in the nature of organizational cultures given the tasks and the other facets of their environments that affect their culture.
Okay, thank you. So next question, please, Yernar.
Thank you. My name is Yernar Zarkesov, Whitechapel Park. My question to Professor James Perry, thank you for your inspiring keynote. During your speech, you mentioned about the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and you also confessed that your study has primarily focused on developed countries, advanced economies. But when you mentioned that, you know, you probably wouldn't want the civil servants who are living into the private sector back to the civil service after some time, because you assumed that these people would be with you know, monetary orientation, monetary incentives. But I would respectfully disagree, because those who are living into the private sector, when it's important to bring them back, because they bring new skills, you know, new practices that might be of high relevance to the civil service reforms, particularly in this country. So in terms of your studies on developing countries, can you please share some insights in terms of what your studies show in motivating civil servants in a developing country context? Thank you.
Yeah, that's going to require another paper. There was a piece published by one of Professor Nair's colleagues at Lee Kuan Yew in 2015 in the Asia-Pacific Journal of Public Administration, which sort of laid out the differences between the research done in the West versus the research done in the East. A lot of it done in China. So, you know, that would be a place to go. I would argue that maybe the differences aren't as great as we think they are. But to be honest, I can't, off the top of my head, without having sort of delved into that specific research. Now, there is some research on career shifts, and I think it's mainly in developed countries. But again, I think that research is instructive to say that people don't necessarily get to the right job at the beginning of their career. So you may have people who don't get a public sector job because the employment queue is full in the government sector when they come out of, let's say, graduate school. They're graduates of the public policy program here in Astana. At some later point, and taking that private sector experience they have, they may bring their public service motivation, their interest in government, to the government sector. I think that's wholly desirable, and we ought to find ways of encouraging that and not sort of have exclusionary rules that prevent people, let's say, from the private sector getting into the public sector at different stages of their experience levels. And that probably goes in the other direction, but I think my argument in the other direction is that often if we get people sort of who are jumping ship after they sort of check a box on their experience, maybe should not have been in the public sector to begin with, but they got there simply because they said, I want to go to the work for government, get in and get out quickly so I can check that box and sort of elevate my salary, which is, you know, primarily personal gain rather than the gain for their government. But, you know, I'm trying to think of sort of the research. For instance, we have like 37 studies done in China. Now, is China a developed country or a developing country? Should we expect, you know, first of all, my expectation was that nobody was going to be doing research on public service motivation in China. Why would they be doing research on public service motivation in China? The answer, I think, is that many of the citizens of China would like to see the party adhere to their sort of their high-minded aspirations as opposed to that which they've performed over many decades in terms of fulfillment of the needs of the citizens. So there's sort of an aspirational element with citizens and scholars in China saying it would be great if we sort of adhered to the logic of public service motivation because that's consistent with the sort of the party line, which is what we're here to serve the citizens. But they see a disconnect between what the party is doing and what the government is doing, and therefore they sort of jumped on the bandwagon of research to say, you need to begin to pay attention to this because among other things, it'll help professionalize the civil service in China, which is essential for Chinese organizations to receive or to achieve the highest aspirations for their citizens, which is, I think, again, consistent with the logic behind the Sustainable Development Goals. That is, employing the public passion to sort of get back, not to the behavioral distinction, because one of the slides I skipped over was that institutional argument is also a normative argument. That is, that people aspire to achieve value for citizens. That's a preference or a desire, not necessarily one that's built on the behavioral research. But I think it's the other argument of piece I cite in the paper is that there's a lot of research that doesn't predict behavior very well, that people buy in because of its normative value or its ideology, but it's dead wrong. And so it would be great if we could sort of reconcile the evidence with the aspirations.
Can I just add that you should look at the motivation of public servants in Kazakhstan, study by the Lee Kuan Yew School. I think it was done in 2014. That will give you some information. In fact, I chose a reference to that colleagues trust their own, among them, trust one another more than support the superiors or trust the superiors came from that study itself. You should refer to that.
I would, okay, please, Ali.
Thank you. Vali Hussein, Azerbaijan State Examination Center. So my question would be one perspective question and one technical question, so one easy, one difficult. I guess to Professor James Perry and Ms. Gulmira Raisova. So I will quote from your kind of a short speech that you mentioned. In order to change the leadership, we should have, you even mentioned that physical removal of the people in the management. So considering that perspective and if the hope for the future, don't we see any hope in the current management when we are looking at their way of the leadership? Is there not any way to improve the way they do things rather than rely on the physical removal? This is the first. And I'm tying that up to Mr. Alhan Bayman's speech where he mentioned dignity as one of the values from the history. So if you're looking at the history that comes with that value up until now, so we need to not maybe link to the future more, but what it resonates in the current management. So we cannot say, okay, current management doesn't have the notion of we'll do something what we say we will do, right? Because most of the time what happens, we say these are the ideals, but then this stays here, and what is actually happening, okay, that was for the more of an event to say what we do is ideal, but maybe the way we do it maybe not that much ideal. This is my more perspective question. The technical question is, I'm coming from the testing industry, and we have this statement, we call it Gotthard's law, where once you make the measure tied to something that you're looking at it later on, then that measure becomes to be a good measure. So how do we take forward the motivational or rewards part where we put that obviously this is how we're going to reward you, and then get back to the quality of the work done? Is there something wrong that could happen? Thank you.
I will try to answer in Russian also. Sorry for that. Вы знаете,
when I said that we need physical change, I meant dismissal. We have to get rid of those who don't fit into the value on internal beliefs, so to speak. When you want to change something in the organization, the leader needs to be one step upper. Do you remember that I have discussed 6 layers of culture? If you want to have the culture of market, then it's one case. And then in this case, you will get the impact in 3 to 4 years. And the rest of the organizations taken into account that he's going to be getting rid of the change. You might get up to 20%, right? You're going to be having 50% of those who would be moving towards the culture of market, and also subject to stimulation. If you want to have an organization to become a market-oriented, then the stakeholder, like the board of directors, all of them need to be having a much higher level of culture. And on the contrary, you're going to be have a mimicry when we declare that we are democratic, that we are market-oriented, but in fact we're going to be remaining the same. We will do whatever our boss says.
Thanks. One, the U.S. Merit System Protection Board just came up with a report yesterday on probationary periods for managers that you want to get your hands on and look at, because it deals with this issue. And it basically says that if you appoint someone as a new manager and they do badly, you sort of pull the plug, and so they don't continue as a manager. I don't think in our federal government, and I can't speak for the states and localities, although the states, I think, or the localities, I think, are in a better position. But so I think there are sort of rules and procedures that we can follow to make sure that we don't have to live forever with a bad manager. Having said that, I'm also a co-author of a new report by the IBM firm on the business of government. That's leadership development. And basically, one of the things, we did 4 case studies of successful agencies, but one of the things we found is that if you go through a list of all the things that leadership development programs should be doing to be effective, our successful programs in the federal government tend to follow those. So we already have a set of rules or procedures or ideas to say, this is an effective leadership development program. The question is, can we get more agencies involved in doing effective leadership development? Are we prepared to invest in that, et cetera, et cetera? So, you know, I think we have the answers to developing leaders as they come up the ranks. And certainly that happens on our U.S. federal government. I don't know other countries, you know, Kazakhstan or others are in the same situation. But I suspect that, you know, if we applied the knowledge we already have and use rules to say, you've been appointed a manager, you're not up to it, let's go fall back to your prior position. That, you know, that would work. That would be one way to sort of work through it, to acknowledge mistakes. The second technical question, I'm not sure I fully understand. But my inclination is to say we don't have perfect measures. And that if we have a measure that tends to be used, but then we've discovered there are other, that it doesn't necessarily capture the full domain of the construct that we want to consider for decision-making purposes, then we got to sort of go back and change the measure or supplement the measure. So I personally have done a lot of measures over the years. I've, you know, measured public service motivation and a variety of other, and collaboration and the like. I would never sort of be inclined to say that a measure is perfect once and for all. Although clearly we want to use measurement in some way to get people to make, to, you know, to assure consistency of decisions across units and also to capture key ideas that are important. But I think we also have to find ways of building flexibility. I'm not sure that addresses your concern, but I wouldn't want to be pinned down to using the same thing forever.
Thank you. So allow me, please, to give the last question to our guest from China, please.
What? It works? Okay. It's fine. Okay, I'm Zhang Xin from China's National Academy of Governance. So thanks to all the very distinguished speakers for the inspiring and insightful speech. And very nice meeting you again, Professor Perry. We have met in Hong Kong before. So you have said something about China's civil servants' motivation things. Actually, recent years, we actually want to do more things in motivating civil servants other than expecting them to fulfill their jobs simply by commitments. So the very recent change in China is that we actually trying to to diversify the civil servants' career development paths. Before, you know, we have nearly 7.2 million civil servants in China, and before they were all crowded in one passage, which is the comprehensive management category. So recently, in 2016, we actually developed management rules for other two categories, which is the administrative law enforcement category and technical and professional category. So we actually developed like 22 more career ladders, ranks for the civil servants. That means that before you can just develop your career within one category, which is the comprehensive administration category. Right now, if you don't get promoted to a leader position, then you can have other development possibility in the other two categories. So it's not, I think it's not a new way. But in China, we are actually employing it to solve the motivation things, especially for the civil servants below the county level. So I would like to hear some of the remarks from our professionals on such practice. What kind of benefits do you think of such categorized civil servants management, or what kind of things we need to pay attention in the future practices? Thank you.
Well, again, I don't know the whole system, but I think to have 3 opportunities to advance in terms of a civil service career is a positive. If you only have one, then when you sort of get to the ceiling on that one and you don't become a leader, then where do you go? Well, you find a place where you can hide every day and just get your salary, but not necessarily do important work. So, I think multiplying the opportunities, just sort of a superficial look would, I think, to me, be a positive thing. And I addressed that. I've got a paper I need to share with you on the compensation that I gave in China in December. And I have a student coming from Tsinghua who's going to be working with me on that. But, I think the Chinese system needs to evolve. But there are some compensation issues embedded in here, because sometimes the compensation goes with sort of the career ladder. And once you sort of reach your ceiling on the career ladder, it also means you reach your ceiling on compensation. That may not be desirable. So creating sort of multiple opportunities can be a plus, I think.
Yes, please. The very final and short, please. Question from our colleague. Yes.
Хорошо. Я представитель министерства.
I'm a representative of the legal department from the Ministry of Defense. I would like to ask a question from Mr. Nair. I'm very interested in Singapore's experience. So the compensation system for state servants, do you have bonuses for state servants, or you have a fixed pay for the state servants? It's number one. And the second question, does the military personnel at your country have a special status, or military personnel is considered as an ordinary state servants? Thank you.
Well, Singapore civil servants have a 13-month bonus that's given. So there is an additional income over 12 months salary plus 13 months. In between half the year, depending on the GDP, the performance, they also have a mid-year bonus. That can be half a month, depending on how it can even be more. They also have differences in bonuses for the lower income. So that would be in pure, not percentage term, but in pure cash. So let's say you're a cleaner within the organization, then you'll be paid as a higher salary that compensate based on your overall. So it'll be more than, if a person get half a month's salary, then these people will probably get 1 month of bonus for their respective money. So there is a differentiation in what level you come through. Then over and above, you will also have performance bonus, how well you performed. That will vary between 3 months, 6 months, depending on how well you've done. So that's the Singapore structure. So a person would actually find that they may actually have half their income in the form of bonuses too.
Thank you. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of the first part. I would like to thank every of our speakers for their great job, and to pass the microphone to my colleague, to Ms. Gulmira Raisova. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear guests, I want to invite to the scene our next speakers. Ms. Katerina Kardava, Director of the Civil Service Bureau of Georgia, member of the Steering Committee of Astana Civil Service Hub. Also, I want to invite Mr. Bakhtibek Saganbayev, an Acting Director of the State Personnel Service of the Kyrgyz Republic, and Ms. Alona Paselka, Head of Unit of National Agency of Ukraine on Civil Service. Thank you very much, our speakers, and I want to give first floor to Ms. Katerina Kardava with her presentation, please.
So, good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today and talk about motivation of civil servants that is believed to be one of the most important parts of modern human resource management. In times of political change, globalization and high social demands, in order to achieve the desired outcome, public institutions need to direct their attention towards the most valuable resource at their disposal, the human capital. Creation of the effective and comprehensive civil service system is an integral part of Georgia's public sector reform agenda. Georgia took a commitment to create a civil service model that would ensure transparent and effective civil service, which would be based on the principle of merit and will promote, support, and reward professionalism. Georgia, as a leader in implementing successful reforms in various fields of public governance, has been able to make significant steps towards introducing modern public governance principles in public institutions. I would like to focus on a number of new legal frameworks that serve as a solid basis for the development of a professional civil service through increasing civil servants' motivation. The new law on Georgia civil service, that is the most important part of civil service reform, sets out the new rules for hiring the professional civil servants, according to which an open competition is applied only for the lowest fourth-rank vacant positions, while for filling the vacancies on higher positions, a closed competition approach is to be applied. Distinguishing between open and closed competitions is a novelty for the Georgian civil service, and introduction of closed competition practice aimed at overcoming the nepotism and protectionism that existed in the country before, as well as to increase the motivation among professional civil servants and to minimize the likelihood of subjective decisions. Through the civil service reform, Georgia took high-level commitment to develop the uniform, systematic, needs-oriented training system for civil servants. The professional development of civil servants has a role in the creation of new values and implementation of required organizational changes. Thus, it is among the top priority of Georgia. One of the main novelties that law on civil service introduced is the new approach regarding the civil service training system. Until now, there was no clear indication of professional development opportunities. New law obliges public institutions to ensure the participation of civil servants in mandatory professional development programs and facilitates their participation in such programs outside the civil service system. The professional development and training of civil servants is one of the links in the chain of human resource planning and development, that is their selection and recruitment in public institutions, as well as their assessment and promotion. The connection of all elements of this system secures the precondition for the efficient and effective performance of the civil servants. As a result of the civil service reform, in order to identify grounding for career development, improve professional skills, increase motivation, and assess needs for professional development, and thus ensures the organizational development of a public institution, and performance appraisal system was introduced in civil service. Establishment of the performance appraisal system for the professional civil servants is one of the key components of civil service law. The new rules provide for a mandatory annual assessment of performance, the results of which are used for planning, motivation, and professional development programs for civil servants. Goals for performance appraisal of professional civil servants are to support career development, ensure continuous professional development, serve as a motivation instrument, and ultimately support growth and efficiency of individual and organizational level. outcome of the appraisal create ground for a number of legal consequences, such as assigning grade to a servant, assigning incentive to a civil servant, etc. New legal framework states rules for a new ranking system. Goals for assigning grades to civil servants aim to improving motivation of civil servants, enhancing compensation, and ensuring stability of civil service. Grade is assigned to a civil servant based on results of performance evaluation. A civil servant who was assigned a professional grade is paid as supplementary to salary, grade supplement. Total number of grades is 12, where grade 1 is the lowest and grade 12 is top grade number. Grades 1 to 6 are assigned to a civil servant for excellent results once in 2 years and at least for good results once in 3 years. Grades 7 to 12 are assigned for excellent result once in 1 year and at least for good results once in 2 years. Assigned grade is constant and withdrawal of the grade is prohibited. Another important achievement of the civil service reform is the new remuneration system. The CSB, with its competencies, elaborated the new remuneration law, developing the general framework of the remuneration system, defining the scope of regulation, general principles, and legal grounds on determining the labor remuneration for civil servants. New system of remuneration rests on principles of equality and transparency, which implies the receipt of equal pay for the performance of equal job in accordance with rules established in advance. Governments can only be effective if civil servants are motivated and able to implement policy and services well. In many developing countries, this remains a remote aspiration. Lack of staff motivation is a real-world fact, and Georgia continues reforming the civil service in order to change this reality. One of the steps the Bureau has made for increasing the motivation and emphasizing the importance of civil servants in Georgia for our country is initiating the establishment of the Day of Civil Servants, but it's the Georgia Day of Civil Servants, not international. As a result, in 2018, the Prime Minister of Georgia announced December 19th to be a Day of Civil Servant, and in 2018, the Civil Service Bureau has acknowledged and awarded the long-serving civil servants in Georgia. The Bureau will keep organizing special civil service-related events on this particular day every year. Increasing the motivation between civil servants is one of the goals of the Civil Service Bureau and thus is reflected in its future plans. Achieving the goals in planning through taking important innovative actions, namely the Bureau plans to encourage the coaching practices in civil service. In the frame of professional partnership between coach and leader, the coaching will help civil servants to develop their personal and professional skills to achieve desired goals in the civil service system. Coaching will play an important role to transfer knowledge, boost confidence, and improve work performance. Coaching will ensure that the more experienced servants to be highly appreciated. Moreover, coaching could become a source of additional income for civil servants, and all in all, it will make a contribution increasing their motivation. Furthermore, the Bureau plans to conduct the research of financial and non-financial motivators in civil service, giving the broad picture of the need of introducing the different motivational schemes to improve the network environment and organizational structure of civil service. Finally, I use this chance to express my gratitude towards the organizers for great cooperation and smooth organization of this conference, and thank you, Господин Alihan.
Dear Mr. Alihan Bayminov.
For attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Catherine. And I want to give next floor to Ms. Alona Paselka for her presentation.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the National Agency of Ukraine on Civil Service, I'd like to welcome you today. My name is Alona Paseka. I am head of International Cooperation Unit. Today, I will present information regarding remuneration reform, my presentation starts from the public administration reform. Then I tell you shortly about civil service reform, who is a civil servant, what is the salary structure, and next steps. Let's move on to public administration reform. Main pillars, it's a public policy development and coordination, modernization of civil service and human resources management, ensuring accountability of public administration bodies, and administrative service delivery. Now I would like to introduce civil service reform. The agency is a leading public body engaged in implementation of the law on civil service. The new law provides an opportunity to introduce a new approach of selection for vacant position, new model of remuneration, modern human resources management, and fundamentally new modern model of training system. I'd like to give you some background information about components of the reform. Its improvement of legal basis for civil service, development of the job classification. Job classification of the civil service will ensure a clear identification of positions, its tasks and roles within the civil service, and will become an effective tool for establishing fair salary. The next one is improving of the remuneration system. The aim of the remuneration system reform is to ensure competitiveness of salary in the labor market, improve level of transparency, predictability, and fairness. Establishing of the competitive salary would facilitate attraction of best experts. Special attention will be paid to those who are engaged in the national reforms, so-called reform staff, or we can say like transforming leaders. The next one is strengthening HR departments' capacity. Human resources departments were established since entering into force new legislation. This process of transforming from old-style personnel management to the modern standards take a lot of time. In this regard, capacity strengthening of the HRM departments is still relevant. The fifth component is about introduction of IT technologies in the public administration, which facilitate better management of civil servants, enable the control of employment, contribute to transparency of personnel management expenditures. The sixth component is the reform of professional training system. This reform is very comprehensive and includes tasks related to needs assessment, development of life learning system, and establishing of training service market. And the last one is strengthening agency capacity. During last 2 years, 2 departments of the reform staff were established in the agency. So who has a status of civil servant, who will actually feel changes in the remuneration reform? According to the legislation, civil servant is a citizen of Ukraine who holds civil service position in a government agency and receive salary from the state budget. At the end of 2018, total amount of civil servants in Ukraine was 209,785 persons. I mean acting civil servants. Now we will look at salary structure. According to the legislation, the salary of the civil servants consists of official salary, long service bonus, civil servants rank bonus, payments for additional workload due to performance of duties of temporarily absent civil servant and vacant position. I want to note that bonus for the performance of duties of temporarily absent civil servant consists of 50% salary of this employee. In particular, payments for additional workload due to performance of duties of vacant position consist of salary savings from that position. As for bonuses, civil servants can be awarded by bonuses according to performance results, which can be paid monthly or quarterly according to overall result of the state body. And bonus on the results of annual performance appraisal is awarded to those who receive an excellent mark for performance of key performance indicators. The total amount of bonuses which may be received by civil servant during a year may not exceed 30% of annual salary. And performance appraisal system, I would like shortly to introduce this new system. The system on key performance indicators was introduced in Ukraine last year. It envisages setting of tasks, key performance indicators for each civil servant, quarterly review of KPI, evaluation by supervisor, and preparation of the report. The purpose of the appraisal is to identify quality of performance targets and development of individual training program. I'll now move on to new model of remuneration. The remuneration is just a part of human resources management. Enough attention is paid to this process as one of the important functional processes in HR system. From January 2019, some provisions on remuneration of civil service legislation came into force in order to streamline the structure of salaries. Currently, the philosophy of payroll calculation has changed. The criteria for evaluating transparency and fair of salaries is the ratio between the official salary and size of bonus in the average salary of civil servant. In compare with the previous period, when before the adoption of new legislation, when the salary consisted of 30% official salary and 70% of bonuses, today the official salary is 70% and bonuses is 30% respectively. This approach allows to reduce extra payments and bonuses and facilitates preventing an establishment of wages by employers at their own discretion, as well as reducing political influence on civil servants. Let's look on the salary target model. According to the public administration reform for 2016 to 2021, which was amended last year, it is expected to cut bonus and long service bonus to 30% in general. This means that official salary will be kept at the current level and permanent and temporary supplements will be reduced. And finally, how salaries will be changed. Next steps. Further steps toward the improving of salary reform will be ensured by regular analysis of salaries, staff numbers, monitoring of market salaries, modeling of the possible changes in the salary market. System. In addition, long service bonus will be reduced. Or another option, it envisages that supplement for the long service may be established at the fixed size, which will not depend from the current official salary, and rank bonus will be liquidated at all. Also, it is envisaged to establish strict criteria for paying bonuses. Its amount will not depend on actual working hours. It will be based on results or maybe team results. Moreover, pecuniary aid will be liquidated or alternatively may be introduced single payment according to the agreement of staff members. Role of collective agreements will be increased. Official salary will be based on market salaries, taking into account budget restrictions. It is expected by the end of the 2021 that the remuneration reform will be finished. The optimization of the number of state bodies will be improved, and the civil servant structure will be significantly increased. In conclusion, I hope this information will help to understand the processes which are going on in our country. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you very much, Alona. Dear participants, we gave floor to Catherine and Alona because they have to leave to the airport, and that's why there are some changes in our program. Okay. And next floor, I want to give to Mr. Baktybek Saganbayev. He's an acting director of the State Personnel Service of the Kyrgyz Republic. Please.
Добрый вечер, уважаемые.
Good evening, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the management of the Astana Hub for your invitation to participate to this forum, so that we could share our experience with our colleagues. And today, my intention was to brief you about the evaluation system for state servants in Kyrgyzstan. This system is has been introduced relatively lately, 3 years ago, and the system was developed along with the new package of laws regulating the activities of the municipal servants, and the entire law. Entirely this mechanism was launched back in 2017. We made the relative analysis, so I would like to draw your attention to 3 major points. So I would like to also brief you about the challenges that we have changed while using this system. So what does the evaluation of the activity of the state servants provides to the municipal or other governmental institutions? So So first of all, the evaluation provides a chance to increase the efficiency of this of the state agency, and what's missing here is that we have tried to deviate from the similar payment principles to all of the state servants, irrespectively of the quality of performance. So what does the evaluation provide for the state servant himself or herself? So there's a chance to move forward in terms of career ladder, one step up, and there's also a chance, based on the evaluation, the state servant may get a monetary and non-monetary incentives, And as I said before, in case of the positive evaluation and appraisal results, the employee will have a chance to be paid more. And at the same time, I'd like to say that we might have premature evaluation and performance results prior to the set terms. As well as have a chance to get other bonuses that I'm going to brief you about a bit later. So what type of issues we have been looking at? So number one is how compliant the servant is to the aims of the state agency. The achievement of professional results, and the evaluation is based on three basic principles: the regularity, transparency, and objectivity. So as of now, we have introduced three appraisals. Once 3 months, 6 months, and 12 years, the annual evaluation is something that may lead to the increase of salary and other motivational bonuses as well as. And the third evaluation is provided for those who have most recently joined the state service or have shifted over to a new position. So I'd like to brief you about how the evaluation is organized. Briefly, the state servant is being evaluated by his immediate supervisor, the immediate supervisor, and the chief of the department. In most other cases, takes a personal participation into the evaluation process. So going back to the procedures. So the state servant needs to be in compliance with the objectives of the state agency he or she works for. And besides, the immediate supervisor also approves the promotion plan in case if there is a lack of achievements. There's a reference of to the standard evaluation form and the standard self-performance improvement form. So please accept my apologies for being so fast. I want to brief you on the key issues. So the criteria for evaluation, the outcomes are looked at in 4 dimensions on the complexity of the text. So we look at how those employees are compliant in terms of performance. And today we have applied so far 5 types of evaluation. So the standard one, the criteria range from unsatisfactory to a high-class performance. So and the highest mark can be provided only for those who have the greatest performance. So we could, as I said, promote the state servant in rank and get him or her promoted and make provide an approval for for training abroad, for instance, or to be somehow promoted. So, in case if the state servant gets the highest mark, then, as I said, he or she may be promoted immediately to a more superior position. And going back to the internal motivation factors, there could be some proposals on any training beyond the territory of Kyrgyzstan, and in case if the servant gets the satisfactory mark, then he or she can have a right to in case if there's an unsatisfactory mark, then there's a proposal of rotating, of dismissing the employee, or downgrading the employee. If the 2 years in a row the employee would get the unsatisfactory mark, then he or she would be surely dismissed. I want to pay attention to statistics. Statistics shows that in the state service, state servants have excellent or good as their major mark, and this problem is one of the key ones because we still fail to manage setting up the clear tasks for state servants. And in case if we could deal with problem number 2, the problem number 5, thanks to introducing the new laws or providing a chance for additional training, then the first issue still remains a crucial one. And raising expectations is still something that remains our key problems. And those problems could be of a very wide range. So at the same time, I would like to draw this question over to you. So overall, briefly, that's all I wanted to mention about. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I will be making you happy. I'm the last speaker. So the current remuneration salary system is morally old. So the question is how to change it. So in this regard, together with the hub and with the developer, we have initiated the new system. that is based on bonus system. And this method has been used by the group of companies. 174 companies have used it, and moreover, those mechanisms have been used by OECD countries, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. So those questions provide us to and at the same time, each and every methodology provides for the following action. Upon appraisal, we have looked at the we need to look at the four functional blocks. The functional block is those dealing with the state policy, and functional block A. We have looked at the and we made it in order to avoid the mistakes in the data. So the system was introduced back in 2015. Akimat Magistan and ASAM agencies were included as the key ones. So, and last year we have included Almaty and Shymkent. You could see the additional results. In 3 times we have the higher competition, and in some cases the competition was 60 people per one position. The Ministry of Justice demonstrated the growth in positions, and the young people are now interested in state service. So our next steps is to upscale this project in accordance with the instructions made by the head of state. So we received the funds to keep providing financial support. Thank you very much. Thank you, Drandos, for your brief presentation. We are over 45 minutes. We don't have any speakers except for Drandos and Bakhtibek. If you have any questions, please ask those 2 speakers.
Also, my name is Admir Shahmanovic. I am Deputy Minister of Public Administration in the government of Montenegro. First of all, I would like to congratulate to Mr. Baimenov and his team for organizing this great event, and to express one more our pleasure to be the part of the initiative of Astana Hub. I would like to listen to all the great speakers today. I would like just to compliment, actually, not to raise a question. Before I go, I just wanted to share the experience of Montenegro briefly, very briefly, because I know I'm the last one that you will hear today, and it's the end of the day, so you can wait to go out from here. Since we are in the middle of implementation of the public administration reform strategy, we are coping exactly with these things in this moment. Where at this moment my colleagues are sitting down with the Human Resource Management Authority and trying to find the best solution for this way. So we have a bit of specific situation in Montenegro, since 30% of active labor force on the national level is working for public administration. We have like 10.5% of GDP is being given away for the gross salaries in Montenegro. So the newest study shows that more than 60% of young people would rather work for public administration for 30% less lower salary than in the private sector. So we don't have a problem to attract, in general, to attract the people, but we have a general problem to keep them. So that's why we are thinking about the defining of the retention policy at the national level, which would define the monetary and non-monetary measures. Of course, the financial aspect of the incentives is very important, but there are also those non-monetary incentives, that would be very appreciated by the public servants, as the one you mentioned, like beside the casual Friday, which is the most easy to introduce. And there are also the work from home, flexible working hours, extra bonus days for vacation and things like that. But we introduced actually a measure that presents the top up of the 30% for the on their salary for the people working with European funds. But considering the fact that their very specific profile and time needed for to gain the skills, so we introduced this measure. But we have to do it also for the IT people, which are a very important aspect of the public administration, and for the engineers. And considering the market supplement that they would give, that they would receive in the private sector. Another challenge in Montenegro is that we have to optimize the number of employees, and we are working very intensively together with the European Commission, World Bank, and OECD to do that. So we defined the optimization plan, and its implementation is in the progress. So we introduced the recruitment freeze in public administration, so we are not recruiting anyone except some exceptions. And then now we have those challenges to decrease the number of employees and to motivate the remaining one that will stay actually in the public administration, knowing that we will produce the negative effects, the negative atmosphere in the public administration. We have to be very creative to motivate them, because this everything comes to the human, to humans, regardless how developed technologies we have. Like the functionality of the administration comes right from public servants. So I'm sorry if I took your time. Thank you.
Much for sharing with us your practices. And Alexander Mikhailович, please give your comments.
First of all, I would like to thank all of the speakers, especially Professor Perry, and as a practitioner, as a person who has studied the international experience, I would like to share the fact that Professor Perry is so concerned about the results to be closely tied with the performance, because we have to be bearing in mind what the mission of the state service is. We have to serve our nation, we have to serve the people of our country, and there's a huge conceptual difference in between the private sector and the public sector. And at the same time, we have to be looking at how to increase the salary for state servants, and at the same time we have to ensure a social package, a decent social package. We have to mention that the social package in our countries is pretty much hidden. Somebody is getting the serviced apartments or serviced car, And those are all incentives. And in some of the cases, people have a chance to use a free medical service, and the others don't have a right to use it. And we have to calculate all of those incentives, material and non-material. And at the same time, we're going to be having a picture when the people would get everything, and would eventually, this would lead to the change in corporate culture. So we have to be pretty cautious about it. That's number one. And the second thing I wanted to make is, again, going back to bonuses, I'd like to draw your attention to the Ukrainian reference. What the Ukrainians did, starting from the 1st of January of 2016, as the speaker said, they have decreased the bonus, they have decreased the premium 3 years ago, because in our region, no other country has an adequate remuneration system, so that you cannot even relate the bonus to the basic pay, because you don't have the remuneration system set up. And as Jandos said, we provide assistance in terms of funding, but the paradox is that we don't have the final draft. Actually, the previous draft that we have received was underestimating the HR services, and then the question was, who is going to be working for the HR services in case that the salary matrix is going to be at the lowest level? And right now the HR and IT refer to Group B. My question is, why IT experts and are getting more and more in private sector, so we won't have any people to work, right? Who's going to work for HR service if we don't appraise it? So it was the first time I heard it, and we went all the way up to the administration of the president, and they said, well, you know, this is not quite right. And the administration of the president said that they would make that correction, and we would get the final draft. So again, Jandos, using this chance again, I would like to convey our message that we have to analyze it again and look at the charts. And the second thing is a decrease of coefficient in between the center and the region isn't something that we have to be praising for the new system, right? Just change the coefficient. It's very easy to do. It's not going to be a systematic approach. This is the question of that is going to be addressed systematically. And overall, it's such a tangible thing. The question is how to merge the two departments, right? Again, going back to the reference that it was made before. Again, we are seeking for professionalization, the HR service, and the overall definition for the HR service was introduced back in 2013. But our aim is to make sure that the professionals come over to that HR service, and moreover, the market, the labor market, and its segment, for instance, for energy experts, for economists, is much broader than the HR. The HR experts, perhaps 100 people, not more. And we want to have stricter requirements for the HR service. So again, the discussion platforms like this one provides us with a chance to discuss all of the minor details and all of the changes. I'd like to appreciate Mr. Gwentat, the Dean of the Civil Service School, the Nazarbayev University. Thank you so much. I would like to appreciate the UNDP and the Agency for Stealth Service, and again, all of the participants, those who are here with us up until the end. Thank you very much, and all the best to you. Thank you. Participants, with this, we would like to close our session formally and officially, and again, success in your new endeavors. Thank you.